Welcome back to Talking About Wood. As promised, today we're going to see an epic battle between pine and spruce. Or maybe not an epic battle, but a comparison. You'll see. Alright, so what we're looking at today is how to tell the difference between a spruce tree and a pine tree. And the reason we want to do this, for one, is to be able to identify in the forest or in the wild which tree you're looking at here, because there are some variances in these trees. And one of the things that we're also going to look at is the boards. So if you're going to the lumber yard, the hardware store, somewhere you're going to pick up a piece of wood, you're going to be able to tell the difference between the pine or the spruce so that you can make an educated decision on what to get. So the first thing we're going to look at are the branches of these trees. Here we have our pine tree, here we have our spruce tree. Now, both of these trees are in the same family of trees, so they're very, very similar. They're both conifer trees, but there are some key differences. So one of the things you're going to notice about the pine is that the needles are longer and the spruce needles are a little bit shorter. Also, the pine needles are a little bit softer than the spruce. Spruce tends to be very hard needles. You touch them, they hurt. Pine needles, I'll show you guys pine needles here. You can move them around. They're pretty soft. They poke a little bit, but it's not really painful. The spruce, on the other hand, if you touch those, they are pretty pokey. That'll give you a little bit of an ouch. So one of the things, though, that we're going to be looking at here is when you're looking at a spruce, you'll notice that the needles on the spruce all come from an individual spot on the branch. They're not grouped together. There's not more than one needle coming out of one spot. And we'll do a close-up of this in a minute for you guys to see. But on the pine tree, what you'll notice is that the needles come in groups of 2s or 5s or 7s, and that they will group up and spread out from the same spot. And this gives a much denser look to a pine tree. The needles are much denser together, and so it looks a little bushier, whereas these ones are really spread out and very distinct. The other thing that's really, really different and unique about these two trees are the pine cone or the spruce cone. So the pine cone, when it's growing on the tree, this is a small one, but it's going to look something like this. It's real hard, it's real packed tight together. This is the classic idea of, a pine cone when we see one. And then when they fall to the ground and they start to open up, they're going to start looking something kind of like this. This is what you'll see in your decorations, especially during Christmas time, something like that. And, so if you see a tree that has these on it, or these, then you're going to know that, okay, this is a version of a pine tree, not a spruce tree. Whereas the spruce cone is really, really interesting and unique. They're a little bit longer, and the texture on these, the feel on these, is a little bit more like paper. It's harder than paper, but they are flaky, they're kind of bendy, and they're really, really long, and these guys will just kind of come apart. They're not going to give you that same hard wooden feel that a pine cone will. The spruce cones are flexible. You can bend them around a little bit, so they'll break. The other thing is that a spruce cone is not going to burn as well as a pine cone if you're out camping. Pine cones can make great fire starters. You get a couple of these, throw them together, they'll burn really well. This one, not so much. So let's take a close-up look at those, and then we'll compare the boards. Okay, we're back. We're going to look at the board. So let's take a look at the pine board here. So this is a piece of pine siding. It's called a tongue groove siding. So it's got a tongue here, a little piece that sticks out on this side, and it's got a groove here. And this is for doing siding. Probably Usually something like this will be used on the interior. This particular piece, because of how it's processed, it's dried and it's a pretty nice piece for the inside. But you can get pine siding for the outside, but those are usually a thicker boards. This is a really thin piece. So this is for interior siding. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice about this is the grain pattern on this piece of wood. There's some tight graining, a little bit of tight graining, but there's some parts here that where the grain really opens up. It's really wide. Also, you'll notice it has these classic knots. So this is a very popular wood for furniture. People like to make furniture out of this because people like these knots. They're pretty aesthetically pleasing, and usually the pine knots are pretty hard. They don't come out. It's not gonna, pop out. So you can make some really nice furniture pieces with these. They stain well. They lacquer well. They looks really nice. Now, when we hold up the spruce in comparison to this, I don't know if you guys can tell the difference so well. I'll give you a second to take a look at it. What do you notice? Well, you can see really big knots on this one, not so much on the spruce. There are knots, but they're really small. And also the grain on this piece of wood is much, much tighter than on the pine piece of wood. So what that's telling us right here is that pine is going to have more of a decorative feel to it. And also it's a little bit yellower in color than the spruce. But the spruce is going to be a little bit stronger, and it doesn't have such big knots. So it doesn't have as many spots that could potentially be weak. The knots on a spruce tree are really, really small and really, really tight together. So spruce actually is a much stronger wood than pine when it comes to building things. So if you're going to do anything structural, you're going to do a fence, or you're going to do something like this with either of these two woods, it's better to go with the spruce. But because of these really small knots and this really tight grain pattern, it doesn't look quite as pretty or as classic as the pine does. So a lot of times people will use this for outdoor, the siding on their houses or something like this, where it's going to get painted over, because the wood will be really durable, really strong. It will last a long time. You can also use spruce for boats, and it's going to be really strong. It bends really well when treated properly, but it's not going to have those big knots like the pine does. So you don't have to worry about one of these being a weak spot or popping out so much on a piece of spruce. So if you're in the store and you're looking at the two pieces of wood, if you see the big knots and that looser grain pattern, you're looking at a piece of pine. The smaller knots and the really tight grain pattern, that's spruce. So why does this matter? Well, this matters because, for one, there's a price difference between pine and spruce, right? Spruce tends to be a little bit more expensive than pine, and you don't want pine for something that's going to be structural. It's just not as great. If it's a decorative piece, fine. And when you're getting into the really big, massive pillars of wood, then it's going to be okay. But usually what we do with that is we put a core in the middle and we put a metal beam or something like this to support the weight, and the pine is kind of a facade on the outside. So even though it looks like a pine pillar, it's really supported by a metal beam inside the center of that. Not always, but this is more common because it's safer. So really what you want to look for when you're going to the store to get a piece of wood is, if you want it to be decorative, if you want it to have that real nice look, go for the pine. It's gonna give you that classic wood look with the knots and the loose grain. And if you want something that's gonna last for a really long time, something for maybe the outside of your house, then go with something like the spruce. That's going to last you probably a little bit longer. It's going to take a sealant better. It's going to hold together tighter. And overall, it's just a stronger wood. So now you know a little bit between spruce and pine. So don't forget to like the video if this was helpful for you. And don't forget to hit the button to subscribe and turn on your notifications. And share if you like it. So join us next Friday for the next video, and we'll see you soon.